Foundation in India International Center for almost 5 years now. And this is the 45th, as I told you, because we take some holiday for this severe summer. So if you calculate, it comes to about 5 years. Today, of late, we have started a series and converted the series into conversations. And we have had conversations with many artists, not only from visual arts, but also from dance and theatre, etc. Today we have SUDARSHAN SHETTY, who will be talked to, in some sense, by SHARMISTHA MOHANTY. SUDARSHAN SHETTY is an important, well-known contemporary Indian artist who has worked in painting, sculpture, installation, video, sound and performance. He has shown both in India and of course abroad. His work has been exhibited at the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum, the Tate Modern London, Mattress Factory Pittsburgh. Well, now the list is so long.
Let's skip that. Yeah.
So most of you would know about it anyway. And in Guggenheim, in Pompidou Center, Dr. Bhau Museum, etc. And he lives in Bombay. His works have found place in many important public collections. More recently, he was the curator for Kochi Biennale. SHARMISTHA MOHANTY is an author who has written 3 works of prose, Book 1, New Life, and 5 Movements in Praise. She is working on a book of poems and also a book of prose. Apart from being a writer, she also runs a journal, Almost Island, and also organizes Almost Island dialogue series, in which she got some very important people coming in. It's held in Delhi in the annex. So there she is talking to SUDARSHAN SHETTY. So now, go ahead.
Thank you.
Will someone remind us when 45 or 50
Yeah.
minutes?
Keep the mic close to your mouth.
Yeah. Okay, I want to open this talk by actually putting something out there. And that is that SUDARSHAN and I are very old friends, very close friends. We've had a friendship of about, 25 years now. Both an artistic friendship and a personal friendship, and I think that as artist and writer we've also been very kindred. And in many ways this can hopefully ease how a conversation goes, that the trust and the kinship can take the conversation far. I also remember here something that Robert Frost said about poets or writers writing about visual artists. He said, we're not interested in critiquing or theorizing or even interpreting. What we want to give is a counter love. So I want to begin with that. One of my earliest memories is of SUDARSHAN's first solo show, Paper Moon. And it opened in Bombay. I forget the year right now.
95.
95, right. And at the same time, my first book appeared, was called Book One. And his show was in a place called the Franji Kausji Hall, because I remember that he always said that he didn't want art to be only in places like museums and galleries. And Franji Kausji was a place which would sell shirts and trousers for 100 rupees and 200 rupees. And he'd always said he wants his exhibition there, and he did have it there. And when I was thinking of where I would do a reading, we didn't call it a launch in those days, where I'd do a reading from my book, he said, why don't you just do it, you know, at Franji Kausji? And I said, but your show is on. And he said, we'll just push all the sculptures to the side, and in the middle of it, you're going to do your reading, and the audience will sit. And it was wonderful, and that's how we actually did it. And I'm telling you this story to kind of say two things. One is his amazing generosity, which he has to this day. And the other is a kind of attitude to the making of art and to art, which is to say that let's not ever make it be precious. So, okay, now my first question. Sudarshan, why did you want to have a writer do this conversation with you and not someone from visual art?
I think those of you who have seen the Binale would not need an answer from me right now.
But some of them may not have.
Yeah. I think it's in some way, I mean, it's also a prerequisite for a lot of us. I mean, I'm not the only one to look outside of your own limitations constantly, or outside of your own studio practice, so to say. That, you know, it kind of, in my own case, personally, in my own work, that it does draw, I mean, a lot of information does come from looking outside.
Outside your media.
Yeah, it's outside of my own studio, so to say. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it.
So should we, I'm thinking, should we start with your most recent show, your most recent large show, because you also had your Rolls Royce show after that. But I was thinking of starting with Shunya Ghar, which also opened here, and most people here would probably have been to the show. So would you start by talking about what impelled Shunya Ghar, the making of it, the process of it?
Yeah. I've been, I think it connects to the first question in some ways, that I was like in the last decade or so, I've been looking at things, okay, like, you know, I mean, I've been thinking of the, you know, since I've been out of the school, I went to an art school which was established by the British more than 150 years ago, and we were taught portrait painting, and you know, and at some point of time, I'm sure that, you know, the Bauhaus grid system got in the way, and, you know, like there was this schizophrenic education that we went through, that at one hand there was British portrait painting that we were taught, and on the other hand we were like taught this spatial grid system that probably came from the Bauhaus curriculum. And coming out of it, you know, like someone said that, you know, look at, you know, there are a lot of things, and, you know, the way we taught Indian art history was just cursory, you know, it was like a half an hour or 1 hour in a week, that, you know, we didn't really understand very much about, you know, like we were taught Gupta art, and, you know, like all the temples and examples of temples and stuff like that. And then coming out of it, you know, someone pointed at this fantastic analogy of, you know, how, you know, the grid system worked, the Bauhaus grid, that, you know, like your first point of reference was in if you made 9 squares, equal squares out of a surface, out of the 2D surface, the 4 points that you get is the first point of reference that you started with, and the worldview kind of got gathered around it, as opposed to when you looked at any miniature painting, that the world, the first point of your contact with the painting, visual contact, is in the center, and the worldview got formed around it, so to say. So there was like a very, very obvious difference between, even if it was simplistic, there was an obvious difference between the way we look at the world, that if you understood yourself well, as opposed to, if you understood well, you'll understand the world well, as opposed to if you understood the world well, you would understand yourself well, if I were to simplify that. So I started thinking about it, because a lot of I grew up with a lot of music and storytelling at home, because my father was a Yakshagana artist, and there were a lot of every day there would be like a bunch of people coming and discussing, and their performances, and I've been a part of. Of course, after I started going to an art school, I almost kind of rejected it for some reason, that I was making these strange pictures, and my parents were worried for a while, because I was good at making portraits before I went to an art school, imitating portraits from magazines of famous stars, that I was beginning to make these strange pictures. So I think there was some value to that I saw, that after having coming out of the school. So is there a way to kind of go around, so to say, around colonization, so to say, if I were to think of it like that, and access things from somewhere that would make sense of how we look at the world naturally as possible, if there was to be a case made like that. So I started looking at Kumar Gandharva, actually. I got interested in Kumar Gandharva. Someone introduced to me him while I was in the art school. And through Kumar Gandharva, I went to Kabir, and Kabir leads me to Gorakhnath. And so this particular work comes from one poetry by Gorakhnath. It was called Shunya Ghar, as I titled it. And as you would remember, I was looking for a translation, a good translation of Shunya Ghar Sheher, Sheher Ghar Basti, Kaun Sota Kaun Jage Hai, Lal Hamre Ham Lalan Ke, Tan Sota Brahma Jage Hai. So it was very hard to find translation. As you would know, there was no translation, like a decent translation of this verse. So I think that was something that also triggered me to do something that. So very often than not, if you look at the idea of Doha, the first line would establish an image, and the second line would come up with another image, not necessarily a counter image, but another image, and there was no way to deconstruct it. If you deconstructed it, it will kind of just fall apart and lose its meaning.
But
what
it's
it
completely opposing images. Right?
Yes, very often they're not like opposing in its character. So what did it do? It kind of created this huge speculative space between those two positions, that it was not anymore about the images that it presented, and it did come from a sense of an abundance, there's an abundance of images, only to point at a certain idea of minimal, so to say that all of this may be meaningless finally. So this is something, these oppositions as somewhat within the same space of experience, as if they are they're not two different things. For example, there is this famous Kabir line which I keep quoting, is that there's one line which says, Lagan bina jage na nirmohi. it literally means that unless you have an intense devotion with something, you will not find the detached, or you will not invoke the detached within yourself. So detachment and engagement with something, as if they are the same thing and they are not in opposites. So this is something that interested me, and what I was trying to do since then was to kind of achieve these oppositions, or like, can you kind of make something with abundance of images and abundance of approach, like, you kind of engage with something and give it so much meaning while making it, only to say that it might all be meaningless in some ways. So Shunyagar came out of that, and so what I started doing was we started making these sets for a film that I wanted to make inside it, not knowing what this film was really about. And as I was writing the script, which took us 18 months to write, the structure was being built and modified constantly, and there was a lot of erasure and addition, and we took this was made in my studio in Bombay, and we took it to an abandoned quarry, and there is this cavity made in the mountain. Am I dragging it too long?
No, not at all.
There's this cavity made in the mountain by having the stone having been taken away to build elsewhere. So we started building this set there while we started filming it, while we had the musician on the in the frame, and we had actors playing out various scenes while the 5 people that helped me make this were in the frame building this set as well. And then I showed it with the set the first time at the NGMA last year, and subsequently it's been shown like 4 times now. So I was hoping for an effect that you went in and you saw this structure, set of 4 architectural objects, and then you went and watched the film, and you came back and saw the structure differently.
Absolutely. So, I just wanted to say a couple of things about Shunyaghar myself, and then have you respond to that, Sudarshan. One is that, if I trace your work from Paper Moon onwards, there are certain, for me, in my own way, I would express it as there are elements of loss, absence, there's a lot of severance, you've always used a lot of cutting, you've used a lot of scissors and severing of things and daggers and sometimes even what is no longer useful, the redundancy of symbols, So, really a great sense of always absence, loss, absence also, the vacant. But in Shunyaghar, I think that for me, how I saw it, it became almost a civilizational loss. And I thought that was a brilliant achievement, So, I don't know, I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? And another question attached to that is that in Shunyaghar, you seem to have a multiple, many mediums, so to speak, right? You had your sculptures at the center, or installations, however you like to call them. You had video, as in almost TV-like images with the navrasas. You had photographs, and you had a film. So, I want to ask you, what impelled that need for all those forms, so to speak?
I think more often than not, a lot of the work I see around my, that it needs to, come from a certain evidence somewhere. That it has to kind of point at that source, and, imagination is often played out in terms of how do you access that, how do you kind of allow for people to access that. I think in this case, my evidence comes from, or my source comes from, a poetry that in itself says that there is nothing, to hold on to. So that is something that interested me. And I think to be able to achieve that, I think, as in my earlier works, there were like obvious kind of references to things, as you would use the word severance. But here, I just wanted to, in some way, get away from that kind of, immediate effects of things. That you need to kind of engage with something for a longer time, that it kind of has, it needs time for you to kind of really kind of get into things. That it's a process that, you see a certain object and then you go watch a film which is 1 hour long, which not many people lasted. So I think, I think I'm getting into an area where, I think some of it also got reflected in the way the Biennale came together for me, that it needed more time, that you needed to kind of, constantly unravel things, that if you didn't spend enough time with a certain work or all of the Biennale, that you wouldn't have it in some ways, that not everything is, handed over with a gift wrapping, so to say.
So, there's one other thing, when I was thinking the last couple of days overall about your work, which I admire very, very much, is that if I take Shunyakar as an example, where I see a kind of, I would say, an unsentimental melancholy, and an emptiness. But everything in your work and in most of your shows that happens for me is that the physical experience and the imaginary experience and the emotional experience and the ideas are all completely intertwined. You can't undo one from the other. And I think, that's also a fantastic achievement for an artist. Do you have anything to say on that?
Thank you.
No, but something seriously more, about your process that addresses that.
I could, I wanted to, when I was working on Shunyagar, when we were cutting it, I just wanted to have it 25 minutes. I was told that more than 25 minutes, nobody's going to watch it. And people finding it very hard to cut. We did cut it 25, it was not working. And we again made another cut with 25 minutes. It wasn't working. And it went on for a week and it wasn't working. And for some reason it wasn't working. My editor, he normally does ad films, and they're very, very used to cutting things for 2 minutes, max. So I said, let's keep the shots and let's see what happens. Let's scrap all this. And what we did was we went back to the first cut and we kind of just kept the shot as it were, as it was. And it started breathing somehow, it just kind of life started entering into it in some ways. So I think, and it kind of, we said, okay, I said to him that even if it becomes 2 hours, we had some 10-hour or 14 hours of footage, and we had shot with 2 cameras in 3 days, and both the cameras were shooting 2 different scenes at the same time, not the one so as soon as we letting it be, and I would say, okay, now it looks like it's exhausted its time, and let's cut there. Even if it's going to be 2 hours, let's keep the same sequence of events and just lengthen the shots. and it started breathing, and it kind of became like 1 hour, 20 minutes or something like that. And then we started, kind of pairing it and, kind of putting in the finishing touches, and it ended up being 60 minutes. And I think it worked very well in that length rather than being half an hour. It kind of doubled its time, more than doubled its time. So I think these kind of things, and while shooting as well, we were like, okay, and someone said, oh, I can, one of the actors said, I can sing well, So I said, okay, why don't you go and, sing there and let's shoot you singing. So it was very, very organic in that sense, that there are a lot of things that occurred very, very organically, even within the frame and without, in that sense. That in some way it kind of extended beyond the framing that we're making. There was like a sense of the world out there, even outside this frame in some ways, both on the editing table and while we were shooting.
I remember we were having a conversation, I think a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about a certain artist, and you said you don't like the work because you said usme dard nahi hai. And I completely agreed with you. Doesn't matter, but I think there's something there. For me, as an outsider, in a sense, to the world of visual art, I see contemporary visual art always as, cutting down or destroying, I don't know, lacerating. But I don't actually see, I mean, people in the audience may violently disagree with this, and probably do, I'm sure, but I don't often see that quality of that we do look for sometimes in a lot of the arts, perhaps.
I guess so, yeah. That's. I think while I say that, I also feel very old-fashioned, and I'm happy for that actually.
Right,
in some
that's
ways,
what I was wanting to ask you.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah. But to be able to explain what that does is
Not
very
explain,
yeah.
to talk around it a little bit for you, what is it?
I find it to be a very, very interesting word, that to say, that can never be translated in,
That's true.
even in Kannada or in Tulu, that the language I speak. I think there's something that, I don't know, how would you explain that? I have no idea, really. Does not necessarily mean pain or, it also can mean beauty and pain and a lot of other things at the same time.
I just remembered that, at one of the writers' dialogues that we did, Ashish Nandi was there, and he was saying that artists have the freedom to mourn and to lament, as opposed to, if you're a historian or a sociologist, you actually no longer have the right to do that. And I find that very beautiful because I think, it is true. So I just remembered our conversation about that. I wanted to ask you about, something that you have been wrestling with really from the early days. The whole idea, and which is now very, how shall I say, very, very contested and very talked about. How do you feel about the spaces where art is shown today and its relatedness or unrelatedness, the museum, the gallery, the white cube? You've always sort of had you've had a kind of fraught relationship with it.
I think not so much in like, when I show in India, because it's not that formulated yet here, but thinking of museum, for example, as an institution, I have a lot of questions, especially when I was thinking about my show in Bhavda Art Museum, that, I had, like, the the first brief was to respond to the objects there. And I was looking at all the objects, and I think like I mean, Bhavdaji Lad would be a good case in example of how we look at museums the way we do now, which is not very synonymous with the idea of museum as per se. So there are a lot of objects that are not dated. There are a lot of objects that are not. They don't have we don't even know where it's come from, and we were told that that a lot of these objects came from J.G. School of Art when they first set it up. The best examples of the crafts the students made, like ceramics or whatever else that were there, would come to land up in this museum, because the director of the museum doubled up as the dean of the J.G. School of Art then. Yeah. And also there are like a lot of these vistas of ideal village life of India, if you see, and
Right.
I mean, it's quite strange to look at all those things. And it became more and more complex over the period of time to think of a show within that museum. So one way was to kind of not look at those objects at all, and do a thing that is completely overlaying,
Or sidestep.
sidestepping. Yeah. So I think we have to also think of institution, museum as an institution, and how do we kind of look at the institution. And like we were having that conversation earlier, before I was giving a talk about the idea of institution and the literacy,
Right.
the relationship between the idea of institution and the idea of literacy, that how so I think, and then like going to the idea of literacy itself, what does literacy mean? Like very often than not, the way we have to operate in the world, it's the language. English, if you spoke in English, people would imagine that you are literate, more literate than if you didn't speak English in that sense. And also thinking of, like I was reading this thing about the Fud painters, great Komal Patari. I mean, I don't remember where I read it really. That he was trying to train one of the Fud painters' sons, or like sending him to school. He was working very closely with them. And by the time he was literate, and he was also training to be the next in line to be the performer in Fud performance. And by the time he reached his 10th grade, he could read and write in English and in Hindi and whatever. And he'd forgotten all the 40,000 verses that he had learned over the period of time. He had to read it from a diary. So all these ideas of literacy, and my father was like dropout, second standard dropout, and I think he was invariably very, very literate person, and very, very deeply involved with the epics, and he was almost a scholar in that sense of the epics, and a great performer. So I think we have to kind of reconfigure and not look at these institutions or spaces that we show in. Or look at it in a different way, and I think like a lot of the people talk about being outside of the gallery space here, which doesn't make much sense to me, because we don't have enough institutions to be able to kind of be outside of it. And I think this position of being outside and inside is something that we should carry forward in some way, that it is lateral in nature. That it's not pyramidal in structure, yeah.
So, I wanted you to talk specifically a bit about your influences and the two things that you talk about a lot. One is your deep interest in classical music, which has definitely grown and evolved a lot in the last, 25 years. And also Yakshagana through your father. And could you talk a little bit more about how those permeate your thought and work?
Well, it's a very large thing to talk about. I think we'll need more time for it. But, I was, for example, I was, looking for my father's old recordings, and just 2 of them were available. And finally, I found them somewhere in Manipal. In one of them, my father is playing, if you all know, Vari Sugriva, battle, that part of it from Yakshagana, from Ramayana. And there's a time when there's a portion when Rama is hit by Rama's arrow. Rama hits his, and he looks at Rama and he says, obviously you are a divine being, and like I have all these sensations, by being hit by an arrow by you. You are, of course, you are Rama. And in the end, he says that, I'm willing to die. He's anyway dying, and I'm willing to die if you promise that I can become you. This kind of transference and this kind of possibility for transference is something that that allows for many more things. That it becomes, in my to my mind, much more complex and much more rich in many ways. This is the way, if you can kind of, and also the idea of, like for example, if you were to kind of, sing a bandish, which is written like, 400 years ago, that there is a way that you can make it yourself, make it your own in that sense. So what does that mean? That it kind of, comes from this huge tradition, and you become, in some ways the performer or an artist becomes redundant. In that sense, you become just a kind of reason for some things. So these ideas, I mean, old-fashioned it may seem, but these ideas really interest me a lot. And yeah, I'm trying to find various ways in which I could bring that in my work.
So this feeling of sort of redundancy and non-authorship, shall we say? I know you have lots to say on that, but do you want to say just a little bit?
I think when you say, when you bring it down, I think it becomes limited when you say authorship. I think it doesn't matter, really, like whose name the thing has on it for that time being, So I think, just the fact that, you could belong to something of a larger scheme of things, and you also have the choice of being outside of it and inside of it at the same time, is something that interests me really.
Outside of it and inside of it?
You're looking at yourself in that sense, as being a performer of a certain thing. I think it's as important for one to be inside of it and be outside of it in that sense, without using the word subjective objective.
Right. So, just thinking that there's another thing I feel very deeply about your work, and it will lead us perhaps to the Biennale, which I'm sure everyone's waiting to hear about. But I was just thinking that you've always made work or been interested in making work which are works of very large gestures, And what has always amazed me is the kind of depth and internality that you bring about, even from those large gestures. And by that I mean that they're spectacular, but they're not spectacles which distance me. They, in fact, draw me very close. And I think that's something very, very beautiful about your work. And speaking of large gestures brings us to the Biennale, which may have been your largest gesture yet, with 96 artists. I think my first question will be, and it's something, we've not talked about, SUDARSHAN, even though we worked on bringing poets into the Biennale. And just to tell all of you that, we constantly were asked, why are there so many poets and writers in this Biennale? and actually there were just 6. So I don't know, it says something perhaps about what it brought. But what I've never asked you, even after the Biennale got over, is what did you finally feel about the presence of poets in this Biennale? What did it do?
I don't know, you should see. I've done it anyway, so I think I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of things that I could. For me, it was an opportunity to kind of bring that. Like for example, if we were to talk about Raul Zurita's work or your work in the Biennale, it created a space, a physical space. For me, like just the experience of walking in Raul Zurita's space, for example, it was not only a literary experience as much as reading his poetry is not only that, as much as reading his poetry is, it kind of encompasses, and I think it kind of opened up a way for me to look. Even to begin with, one of the first people, as you know, you called Raul Zurita, and then we asked him, and it kind of started opening up in the conversation that we had, or the conversations we had with Anamika. It opened up ways in which I could look at the art world in a very different way, even within the art world, So it became a guiding spirit in many ways to kind of include people who are operational within the art world, so to say. I think that was one of the first things that allowed me to sidestep from my own limitations of, my way of looking at a sort of biennale, the idea of a biennale. That was the very first thing, and I think it worked very well. That it, in some way, because it began with a few writers, that it seems like, that it became like central in that sense. These artists' works became central to the idea of the Biennale in that sense. And that's true, and that's how it worked, yeah.
Maybe it became central also because I was thinking, I was actually looking it up as well, that, writers have not really participated in the center of a Biennale in this way, as far as I know. They've been, I think Documenta or something had a space where they would invite a writer every iteration, and the writer would sit in a room and write. I mean, that's not really participating, in some ways. So I think it shifted something, probably.
Probably, yeah. I hope it did,
So, we've talked quite a bit. We should probably throw it open to all of you for comments, questions.
The mic will go to you. If you raise the hand, first one has to shoot. And then, of course, there will be many who join in. So, whoever.
I don't have a question, but there's some comments.
Let the comments be brief, very brief. Brevity remains the soul of wit.
Just a little thing about that. I remember a conversation with some friends who are classical musicians, and they talked about playing the sarod and playing the sitar. And they said the sitar, because of its ability to have half notes and trebles and fibrillations between notes, that the sitar is capable of that, whereas a lot of the other stringed instruments are not. So that's a little bit of an elaboration of what that could mean. There was one more comment, but I think I've...
No, boy, go ahead.
No, I'll remember it.
Okay.
Someone else. Yeah, thank you.
And a stand here. So yes?
No, I don't have a question. I can hold the mic.
Okay.
No.
My second thing is, I think like a film of 1 hour. Now see, the thing is, one has a lot of preconceptions, and one lives within a world of work and appointments and urban whatever. So when one goes to an art show, if one knows that a film is part of it, and that is going to be one, you know, mentally, like I remember I went to a Kodiatam thing, I had no idea that those performances go on 6 hours. I thought evening show, 1 hour, 2 hours. University halfway across town is going on. Everyone left because of transport and, you know. So by the end of the evening, there were only 6 people out of like maybe 500 when it started. So a little bit of saying recommended time 3 hours, then people know, you know, that they should spend at least 1 or 2 hours there. You know, a little bit because, you know, like that Shunya Ghar, I mean, one went expecting the way normal NGMA, you know, you spend an hour or 1.5 hours. And so a little bit it's that, you know, that it's, we have some ideas of what to, how much time to allot between our other.
Yes, do you have any response to that?
I didn't get the question. I mean, it was a question. Yeah.
No, there was no question.
Not you.
Anybody else? You can carry on if you have some questions more. Why not?
You want
still
to
have
talk
time.
about something that's close
Do
to
you want to say without any questions?
Yeah,
Without,
why not? I
why
think
not?
that's
Go
what
ahead.
we should.
I wish I could sing well.
I would like to ask one thing.
Yeah.
You were talking about the point of references. You said 9 cubes.
Oh.
You said 9 cubes and then you have 4 references. And similar references we even use in photography. So if you can elaborate on that, that will be good.
Well, we were taught that, you know, you draw, like, you know, if you had a surface, you, a rectangular, I mean, more often than not, like rectangular or square, you divide the space vertically and horizontally in 3 equal parts, and then you get 4 points in the middle, and never have something, they used to call it the golden mean, so never have it in the center or anywhere else, but, you know, in these 4 points. And your first, and like we were given a lot of examples of, you know, a lot of older, like, paintings in history that followed that principle.
And then you have that golden spiral.
No, that I don't know.
Hello. We've heard Sudarshan speak on various occasions about his experience with the Biennale, what all he was thinking about. And I wanted to ask you, Sharmistha, about your involvement with the Biennale, and as a poet, as someone who's organized all of these, what is the festival called? The Island?
Almost Island.
Almost Island events, some of which I've even attended. And entering a space like this, what exactly did it do for you in terms of your own practice? And did it open up something that you found specific in the space of art? Or was it a way to fit in to an art context? Or do you think that there was something that it did for you in terms of give you an impetus to unfold or expand your practice in a certain sense, which you find, say, an Almost Island event or other spaces don't?
Well, definitely not fitting in, because I never do anything where I would have to fit in. Almost Island, as you know if you've attended it, is a very intimate kind of gathering, and where we talk about issues of craft and form and culture. And the Biennale is a huge, huge show, so they're 2 completely different things. It's a hard question for me to answer, you know, what did I get out of it, honestly speaking, because I think about it a lot. I mean, one is, I saw more visual art than I've seen in the last many years. I don't really watch that much visual art. But this time, seeing Sudarshan working closely, building up the Biennale, obviously was I think it's still too soon for me to say. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from him and how he's worked. As for my own work, sorry. As for my own work, I just think that it was a really wonderful opportunity for me to take poetry make poetry physical, as it were, you know. And the thing is, you know, from the beginning I knew it could not be prose because it couldn't be a chunk of text hanging there or being projected or being spoken, you know. It just had to be a poem. It had to be something very spare and quiet. And when I chose the space that I did, which is right on the sea, and from the door and the windows you look out at the water, and it's an empty room otherwise, and I decided to keep it empty. I think something happens when you work with space and the poem starts. You know, what I would say is I don't think the poem changes because the spine is still the poem for me as a writer. But it kind of accrues additional meanings and additional nuances. And I have to let some time pass before I know what those additional meanings and nuances will do for me, how they've impacted me, really. You know, I still think it's more for others to say, really.
Sorry, just to quickly add, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Yes, okay. So, I mean, there's obviously an observation of more poets around as well, or at least those 5 others who also participated, and one seeing their works breathe, as Sudarshan nicely put it about his own work. My question is also coming from the fact that there's obviously a sort of reflection on the very syntax, the very structure, the very performativity of one's medium, being a poet. And so, even though this experience is very close to you, would you think that what this has lent to your understanding of, say, poetry making, would also translate back into the field of literature and poetry festivals? Or do you think it's something that then may also get carried back into the field of literature for exploring those other expanded syntaxes, expanded performativities?
You know, I'm a bit of a purist actually, so my instinctive answer would be no, even though it was a very intense and incredible experience. It doesn't automatically make me feel I want to do more poetry installations because I think what is singular, and I wrote about this, I wrote an article, I forget where, in the Express or something, about the fact that the poets all stepped out of their comfort zone to be in the Biennale, right? They all created, someone made a pyramid, Zurita, you know, this huge kind of water that you had to walk through, someone made a scroll, you know, I did a projection. But I think we're very aware that we want to negotiate this new space and it's exciting for us. But we're really poets, and that's where our core lies. And I guess you could call it purist or not, I don't know. But that would be my answer to you. And as far as bringing it into literary festivals, no. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a very anti-literature festival person, so definitely no.
Literary field, no. But yeah, I see what you mean. Thank you.
One little comment.
I think he has. Yeah.
No, I've already spoken.
You said something very interesting. You said, you know, you wish you could sing, and you clearly feel music very deeply, you know, and you can express yourself in another art form. So it's very interesting. We're very interested in knowing how you see the correspondence between music and the art form that you use for your expression, you know, or does music inform and how does it inform your art form?
You already spoke a little about that because I asked him that question, but anyway, you can repeat, I suppose.
Yeah. I think not directly so. I mean, it's not a kind of thing that you kind of borrow from somewhere and put it across somewhere. I think it becomes a part of your life in some ways. And I've been listening to music for, like Sharmistha mentioned, for about 25 years now, or 30 years maybe. I'm deeply kind of interested in, like, all the structures, that where it came from and what's the history of these structures that it came from. Why does one gharana sing a certain way as opposed to another gharana? And all these, I think, some way kind of informs in a manner that it's not entirely advertent. It just is there in some ways. I can feel it. It's coming from a certain source. So now, like, for example, the way Kumar Gandharva sings, say, a Kabir's Doha, and why does he sing it in a manner that he does, and where does he draw it upon from? It's also an important thing. And I think, these artistic choices is something that interests me in terms of, how the structures are understood in a way that it kind of brings about a certain effect, or not. I mean, that's like a very bad word. But how do you kind of appropriate a certain structure from somewhere to be able to create another space out of it. So I think, Kumar Gandharva very well does that. It takes me very close to Kabir, much more than as opposed to my reading of Kabir from a page. So that is something that interests me, and I think, my effort is at kind of getting that sense in my work in some way, rather than kind of just drawing out directly from something. In that sense.
Ashok, did you want to?
In the end, I shall speak anyway.
I wanted to say something. It's a bit of a comment on the Biennale, but maybe this is a good moment to say this. What it did for me, the strongest thing that the Biennale, for me it was a very, very, something I liked hugely, was, a lot of us grew up with the other arts, one could say that, being very close to us, being in conversation, trying to understand structures of music, or whether it's theatre or poetry or whatever. So if I bring in the anecdotal for a second, I think it would be okay to do that. I came of age as an artist in the early 90s, I guess, and then again, in Delhi, and then there were all of these people which one was feeling very nourished by, all various things, a poet or a musician or an amic or a theatre person, etc. But as we grow in our fields, and then we get sometimes even a bit neurotic about pursuing our careers, all these other things fall on the sides. These are things we enjoy in our own personal space. And I thought what this Biennale did was it once again created this amazing synergy between all of those things which we intrinsically, intimately believe in, and brought them in one platform where they were no longer peripheral, but they all were in an equal dialogue with each other. So for me that was quite amazing. And just in addition to what you were speaking about earlier about literature and the presence of a few poets, and they were just 6, but they were so hugely felt, is again, as you said, and as Sabi said, for me it was how thought through poetry and literature was made so physical in space. So seeing that, I think, was probably the most wondrous experience in this Biennale. With your work, with and the other person, those people who kept writing, which became like an inadvertent performance in a way, through the Biennale. So all of that, I suppose.
Well, you have spent nearly 3 decades in the realm of art. There runs a Latin proverb, as longa Rovis, which is the later translation of an aphorism by Hippocrates that art is long, life is short. So how you look at this quotation or aphorism? Whether you think it in Latin or you think it in English? So I have given you both the renderings. And if this title, for example, art matters, can it be also replaced or substituted by this aphorism, eris longa vita brevis? How do you feel about this? Art is long and life is short.
We must all believe in truisms, whether we like it or not.
That's a very good answer. Kavin, you had a question.
This is moving away slightly. Your interest in music, and since we are talking about visual art and representational art at some level, the Ragmala series, I just want to know, what are your feelings? Because we are also talking of that, which is very potent in music, which is also very potent in visual arts. But is it when a rag is represented pictorially, are you able to sense that? Is that something you respond to, connect to, doing the kind of work that you do? Also, you said that at many levels, though I think you use the word purist rather than traditionalist. Do you respond to the Ragmala paintings as a visual artist yourself?
This is a very like a vast question. Yeah, I do. But very often not necessarily in direct relationship with the rag that it represents. I think I see it as an individual work. That what it may evoke of the raga is another thing. It's not. Yeah. That's all I can say. I'm not really an expert on Ragmala paintings.
Is there anybody else?
Well, friends, let me start by saying that I went to the Biennale for the first time, although in hearing about it and supporting it in some small way even earlier. But as a poet, I felt very happy, because not only these 6 poets, there was a lot of poetry within the artworks. In fact, I was struck that such a huge exhibition, and there are many, many works, including the Pyramid of Exiled Poets and such like, which is using poetry. And that gave me a nice kind of a feeling. The other thing that you said, Kumar Gandharv used to, I once asked him, उसको हिंदी में कहना ज़्यादा ठीक है, मैंने उनसे पूछा कि ये निर्गुण क्या होता है? और ये निर्गुण वो है जो चोट तो करे पर घायल न करे. This was his way of saying. और दूसरा उन्होंने कहा कि निर्गुण में आवाज में शून्य पैदा होना चाहिए. Now you were saying, if I got you correctly, that you wanted all these things to be there, to be a big conglomerate of things, and yet the nothingness of all. This is exactly what is happening in Kabir. One of the other things that Kumar Gandharv used to sing, Hum hai sabma, sab hai hamma, hum hi bahuri akela. We are in all are in us, and yet alone. So this notion that there is presence, but at the center of the presence, there is absence. Or you can put it the other way around, that absence is surrounded by presence. And these are notions which were very familiar to poets like Kabir, etc. As for the Ragmala question, actually if you know the Rag, you will find it very difficult to see. So they are two independent works. They happen to be, let's say, somebody inspired by the Rag. And it's very interesting, if you watch some of the Bhakti poets, all of them, most of them, including Surdas and Kabir, had a Rag written at the top of there, as if it is a bandish in that Rag. I have heard no classical musician singing those bandishes as bandishes in Rag indicated by. In fact, the classical music, Hindustani classical music, never adopted them as bandishes at all. All these Bhakti poets had bandishes written on the top. I mean, these padas with, but they were never. So I think there is something interesting in what you're saying, that you have a, which happens more easily in poetry, but to make it happen visibly is perhaps more difficult. That is to create a lot of noise to indicate the presence of silence. You know, it's very difficult. Similarly, it must be very difficult that you create a lot of many visibility, things, objects, this, that and the other, in order to create a void. Incidentally, Linda has translated Kumar Gandhar's Nirgun Bhajanas, and she called the book Singing Absence. That's the name of the book. So it is this which I think fascinates one, and I had never known your connection with Kumar Gandhar and things of that kind. But one of the things we have been trying in the Raza Foundation for a long time is to bring those who are now fallen apart. It's very strange that in modernism in the West, some of the movements were in various forms. So Impressionism was not merely in visual arts, it was also in music, it was in poetry. Surrealism was not merely confined to visual arts, it was also elsewhere. Now that has ceased to happen here. It happened earlier, but now we have completely fallen apart. No poet knows what is happening in the world of visual arts. No visual artist, except a very few ones, and I was happy to find you one, knows what's happening in poetry, what's happening in... Musicians would know completely nothing unless they are invited to open, then cut the ribbon. You don't see musicians ever coming to, art shows and things of that kind. So there is a complete divorce between the arts which has taken place, and this has happened in the modern times. Until the 19th century, you have everything together. You are sharing the same symbology, you're sharing the same imagery, more or less many things were common. And yet, as comes the modern in India has been very disruptive. And I think one of the ways in which we are trying now to, shall we say, you said something about colonization, the damage of colonization to be undone in some ways. And this is one of perhaps the ways which so I am very happy to know that. Ladies and gentlemen, you have had a very interesting, provocative, intellectually dense conversation, and we are very grateful to SUDARSHAN SHETTY and SHARMISTHA MOHANTY. May I, on behalf of you, present flowers to them. We have, people in Delhi are getting sick of us, quite frankly. We do so many things. Sometimes it 2 things in a week. These national institutions of lying in deep slumber or lethargy hardly ever do. But anyway, on the 14th we have, in the India Habitat Center, Keluchar Mahapatra Memorial Lecture to be given by Kumudli Lakhya. This will be at 6:30. 6:30 we give you tea, at 7 you will suffer at the lecture. At 6:30 you can have a cup of tea. And on the 17th, also in India Habitat Center, we are having a tribute to Kishori Amodkar, who died, as you know, recently. So all of you are invited, and all of your friends who are not here, tell them what they are missing. And I'm absolutely certain, by age of 77, that they are not doing anything more important than what happened here. Thank you very much.
It was very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Did it go well, Ashok, according to you?
Yeah, yeah.